No one expected the quiet kid to wake up with vengeance in his eyes, but what happened the next day shocked the entire school to its core. They thought it was just another day to assert their dominance, another weak kid to crush under the weight of their cruelty. But when Tyler stumbled into school that Monday morning, still nursing the bruises from the brutal assault in the locker room where three bullies, Rex, Damon, and Jay, had cornered him, choked him until he passed out, and left him lying unconscious beside a row of lockers, everything changed forever. The moment his eyes fluttered open on the cold tile floor with blurred vision and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, something inside him snapped, not the way it does in movies where someone instantly becomes a hero, but slowly, like a storm gathering behind calm eyes. And while the rest of the school went about their day, pretending not to notice the violence that had become a daily ritual in those halls, Tyler was planning, calculating, silently feeding on rage and humiliation. He didn't go home that night. He went somewhere else. A place his older brother had once taken him when he was still around. A grimy basement gym run by a retired MM, a fighter named Kane, a man who didn't ask questions but recognized pain when he saw it, and gave Tyler exactly what he needed: gloves, a heavy bag, and permission to hit something until it stopped hurting. And all night long, Tyler did just that, fists pounding until knuckles bled, until he could barely lift his arms. But even then, the fire inside him only grew stronger. Tuesday morning, Tyler walked into school not with fear but with focus, dressed in a hoodie that shadowed his face, earbuds in, head down, but not because he was hiding, because he was hunting. And when he found Rex leaning against the cafeteria wall with his usual smirk, flanked by Damon and Jay laughing like nothing had happened, Tyler didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to Rex and without a word delivered a punch so clean, so brutal, it shattered the silence of the cafeteria like glass. Rex crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, his nose pouring blood, and before anyone could react, Tyler turned on Damon, who lunged at him with a wild swing that missed by a mile. Tyler dodged, grabbed him by the shirt, slammed him against a table, and drove his knee into his gut, dropping him like a sack of bricks. And then came Jay, the biggest and meanest of the three, who thought size made him untouchable, but Tyler had been preparing for him. As Jay charged, Tyler sidestepped, grabbed a tray, and smashed it across Jay's face, sending him sprawling into the vending machine with a loud crash that silenced the entire cafeteria. By now, teachers were rushing in, students filming with wide eyes and open mouths, and all anyone could say was the same thing over and over: "That's the kid they choked out yesterday." But it wasn't over, because Tyler, panting and trembling, stood over the wreckage of the three boys who had once ruled those halls and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You thought I'd stay down forever?" before throwing his bloodied fists to the floor, letting the weight of everything he'd carried fall away. And as the principal stormed in demanding answers, dragging Tyler to the office, half the school stood up and clapped, not because they supported violence, but because finally, someone had stood up to the monsters they'd all been too afraid to challenge. And as Tyler sat in the nurse's office waiting for his mother and suspension papers, his phone lit up with dozens of messages, videos of the fight already going viral, captions calling him a legend, a hero, a symbol of not taking it anymore. And sure, the school punished him, suspended him for 2 weeks. But something had changed. No one dared touch him again. The bullies were sent to an alternative school, and the administration was forced to acknowledge the culture of silence they'd let grow, installing cameras in blind spots, bringing in counselors, launching anti-bullying campaigns, all because one boy refused to let his voice be strangled in a hallway again. And as Tyler sat in his room that night, bruised but unbroken, he didn't feel like a hero, just someone who finally stood up, not just for himself, but for every kid who ever got knocked down and told to stay there. Asterisk. The 2-week suspension didn't feel like punishment to Tyler. It felt like freedom, a chance to breathe after years of being suffocated by fear and humiliation. And though his knuckles were still scabbed over and sore, the fire inside him hadn't dimmed. In fact, it burned brighter, fed by messages from classmates he'd never spoken to, confessions from others who had been victims of Rex, Damon, and Jay, students who once walked with their heads down now walking a little taller because Tyler had shown them it was possible to fight back and win. And though the administration tried to keep it quiet, everyone knew the truth. The bullies were gone, the tyrants exiled, the school atmosphere shifting like clouds clearing after a storm. And when Tyler returned, there were no whispers behind his back, no mocking laughs in the hallway, only silence and eyes that followed him with a mix of awe and caution, because he wasn't just a student anymore. He was a symbol of defiance, a quiet revolution in sneakers and a hoodie. And yet Tyler didn't bask in it. He knew the damage hadn't started with Rex, and it wouldn't end with him. So instead of fading into the background or letting himself be worshipped as some mythical avenger, he started paying attention, listening, noticing who was being ignored, who was shrinking into lockers, who was holding back tears behind fake smiles. And slowly, carefully, he began to speak to them, not like a savior but like someone who understood. He ate lunch with kids who usually sat alone, walked with students being taunted, and when he heard whispers of new bullies trying to rise up to fill the void left behind, he didn't confront them with fists, he confronted them with facts. With confidence, with a stare that said, "Try me," and they didn't, because by now, Tyler wasn't alone. He had unintentionally started a movement, a quiet alliance of students who had once been silent, but now stood a little taller, walked a little prouder, and though the teachers tried to take credit, hosting seminars and printing flyers, everyone knew it began with one moment in the cafeteria and a boy who refused to stay broken. But trouble wasn't done with him, not by a long shot, because violence, once stirred, doesn't always fade quietly. And word had reached Rex's older brother, Mason, a former dropout with a record, a temper, and a twisted sense of family loyalty, who didn't care about school rules or honor, only revenge. And when he showed up outside the school gates one Friday afternoon in a black hoodie and gloves, waiting with a metal pipe in hand, it was only by luck that Tyler spotted him before walking straight into the trap. But Tyler didn't run. He remembered Kane's words, "Fighting angry is stupid. Fighting prepared is power." And so he backed away, pulled out his phone, and started recording, not for the views, but for protection, capturing Mason pacing like a predator, muttering threats, pipe clutched tight, unaware that within minutes, the footage would be shared to a local parent group. A teacher would call the cops, and Mason would be tackled to the ground before he ever swung once. And that video, raw and real, would do more than go viral. It would ignite a firestorm of outrage from parents demanding safety, accountability, and real change, finally forcing the school board to approve long-delayed security reforms. While local news painted Tyler not as a troubled teen, but as a resilient survivor who sparked reform in a broken system. And through it all, Tyler stayed grounded, not chasing fame, not playing victim, just showing up every day with steady eyes and open ears, continuing what he started, because somewhere along the way, his revenge had stopped being personal and started becoming something bigger, a rebellion against the silence, a stand for the weak, and proof that even the smallest voice can shake walls if it refuses to stay quiet. And as the months passed, with bullies replaced by watchful eyes, with fear replaced by cautious hope, Tyler realized something. He had changed to not just stronger, but sharper, more aware, not a hero, but a fighter who now understood the cost of staying silent. And even though the scars remained on his body, in his mind, they no longer defined him. They reminded him that standing up, even when it hurts, even when it risks everything, can ripple through a place like wildfire, burning away fear and leaving something stronger behind. And yet, despite the transformation around him, Tyler knew the battle wasn't over, because bullying didn't always look like fists or bruises. Sometimes it was words whispered behind backs, cruel jokes passed off as humor, or exclusion that cut deeper than punches. And so he began organizing quietly, at first creating safe spaces where students could speak openly without fear of judgment. Inviting others to share their stories anonymously through a school newsletter he and a few trusted classmates put together, and soon those stories spread like sparks, awakening others who had once felt invisible, giving voice to the voiceless. And with every shared experience, the power once held by fear began to crumble further. Teachers started listening, real discussions replaced hollow assemblies, and even the most cynical students began to admit change was real, and it had a face. Tyler's. Not just as the boy who fought back, but as the leader who refused to let the next kid fall alone. Because in the end, his revenge had become a revolution, and he had no intention of letting it stop there. It had been 3 months since the fight that changed everything, and while the scars on Tyler's knuckles had faded, the impact of his stand still echoed through the halls like a quiet anthem of defiance. But with every step forward came new challenges, because real change never moves in straight lines, and not everyone was ready to let go of the old order. Whispers started surfacing, not from the old bullies who were long gone, but from a new type of threat, subtle, calculating, wearing smiles instead of sneers. Students who didn't use fists but influence, who manipulated with rumors and social pressure, isolating the ones who didn't conform. And while the school looked peaceful on the surface, Tyler saw the shadows growing again, this time more carefully hidden, and he knew he couldn't face it alone. So he gathered the same students who once watched him fight and asked them not to fight with their hands, but with their presence, their words, their support, forming what they started calling the Line. Not a club, not a gang, but a silent force. Students who stood next to kids being mocked, who posted messages of support online when someone was targeted, who made it clear that cruelty, no matter how quiet, would not go unchecked. And the Line started gaining attention, not just from peers, but from teachers, parents, even local reporters, who began calling Tyler a student leader, though he never asked to be one. Never wanted to be anyone's icon. He only wanted to make sure what happened to him never happened again. But leadership comes with weight, and soon Tyler felt it pressing down on him like it had before. The expectations, the stares, the responsibility to always be strong, always be right. And one night, as he sat alone in his room, scrolling through messages from students in pain, stories of abuse, neglect, fear, isolation, it all became too much, and for the first time in months, he felt that old panic clawing at his chest, the same helplessness he thought he had buried back on the locker room floor. And in that moment, he realized something important. Even heroes need help. And so he reached out, not to Kane, not to teachers, but to his own group, his own Line, and told them the truth, that he wasn't okay, that he needed a break, needed time to be just a kid again. And instead of losing respect, something amazing happened. They stepped up, took over the newsletter, kept the movement going without him. Not because they had to, but because they believed in what they were building together. And Tyler, for the first time, allowed himself to heal without guilt, knowing the change he sparked no longer depended on him alone. And as weeks passed, things didn't just stay better, they grew stronger. With student-led initiatives tackling mental health, peer mentoring programs inspired by his story, and even a district-wide anti-bullying campaign that featured Tyler's voice, not as a victim, not as a fighter, but as a survivor who chose to rise, and rise again and again. And by the time senior year rolled around, Tyler walked the halls not with fear or fire, but with calm, because he no longer had to prove anything. And when new students came in, wide-eyed and nervous, they were greeted not with silence or stares, but with community, with a culture that said you belong. And while the world outside the school still held cruelty, inside those walls, Tyler had helped build something unshakable, not perfect, but better. And that mattered, because every time a student stood up for another, every time a voice was heard, Every time someone chose kindness over power, it was proof that one moment, one punch, one choice to say enough could ripple through hundreds of lives. And as Tyler stood at graduation, looking over a crowd of faces who no longer feared the shadows, he didn't smile because he'd beaten the bullies. He smiled because together, they'd beaten the silence. Summer had melted into memory, and as fall swept in with golden leaves and cooler winds, Tyler found himself stepping through the gates of a new world college, a fresh beginning filled with unfamiliar faces and vast possibilities. But even though the buildings were different, the challenges felt eerily familiar, because cruelty didn't vanish with age. It evolved, wore better clothes, spoke with smoother voices, and now came wrapped in elitism, exclusion, and a hierarchy built on wealth, legacy, and appearances. And while Tyler had hoped the battles he fought in high school would stay behind, he quickly realized that injustice traveled with you unless someone stood in its way. And as he settled into campus life, he noticed patterns: international students mocked in whispers, first-generation students excluded from study groups, professors turning blind eyes to casual harassment, and beneath it all, a quiet hopelessness in the eyes of those who felt invisible. And once again, the old fire stirred within him, not out of rage this time, but responsibility, not to fight alone, but to ignite something bigger. So he began slowly, the way he'd learned it, by listening, by observing, by building trust, reaching out to those who sat alone in dining halls, organizing informal meets disguised as study jams that soon grew into safe spaces where students could vent, share, and laugh without fear of judgment. And word spread about the calm, sharp-eyed sophomore who listened more than he spoke, who remembered names, who stood up quietly but firmly when someone crossed a line. And soon students began inviting others, creating a network that started resembling the line from back home. Except this time, it wasn't just about bullying, it was about belonging, about dismantling the silent barriers that kept students isolated and afraid. And though Tyler tried to stay humble, focusing on community over credit, his efforts caught the attention of campus administration, who invited him to speak on panels, lead workshops, and advise new student orientation programs. And while he accepted, he never let the spotlight distract him from the core mission: seeing people who were overlooked and reminding them that they mattered. But even as his circle grew and his influence deepened, Tyler battled internally with the weight of leadership, haunted by the fear that he might fail again, that he might miss something important, that someone might fall through the cracks while he wasn't looking. And in one particularly overwhelming week during midterms, he found himself on the rooftop of the library, breathing heavy under the pressure, questioning whether he was truly making a difference or just plugging holes in a sinking ship. But then his phone buzzed with a message from a freshman named Mira, someone he'd barely spoken to, who wrote simply, "Your group saved me from dropping out. Thank you." And in that moment, the weight in his chest lightened, not because the pressure was gone, but because he remembered why he started. Not to be perfect, but to be present, to offer hope in a world that often pretended not to care. And with renewed clarity, Tyler leaned back into the work, not as a savior, but as a connector, helping form mentorship bridges between upperclassmen and freshmen, starting a podcast that amplified student voices and untold stories, launching monthly meets that tackled topics no one wanted to talk about: loneliness, imposter syndrome, mental health, microaggressions. And though not everyone agreed with his approach, and resistance came from those who preferred the old ways, the culture slowly began to shift, not with grand announcements, but with everyday actions: students holding doors, checking on one another, intervening when something felt off. And as senior year approached, Tyler was no longer the quiet kid who had once been choked unconscious in a locker room. He was a leader of change, not because he wanted power, but because he refused to look away when others were hurting. And on the day he received an unexpected nomination for a National Student Leadership Award, he didn't think about the ceremony or the title. He thought about Rex. Damon and Jay, about the day he woke up on that cold tile floor and decided never again. About the friends who carried his mission forward. About the moments of doubt and healing and learning. And most of all, about the hundreds of lives he had touched just by choosing to see people and remind them of their worth. And as he walked across campus under the orange glow of autumn, surrounded by laughter, conversation, and genuine connection, he understood something deeper than ever before, that true revenge isn't violence. It's transformation, and his greatest victory wasn't the punch he threw, but the legacy he built from it. And as graduation neared, bringing with it the bittersweet weight of farewell, Tyler took time to walk the paths he had once walked as a stranger, now filled with familiar faces, kind nods, and grateful smiles from those whose lives had been shifted by his presence. He was invited to give a farewell speech at the senior gala, and as he stood before hundreds of students, faculty, and staff, he didn't speak about his achievements or the awards he'd collected. He spoke about silence, about the quiet moments, when someone needs help and no one sees it, about the power of choosing to care when it's easier not to. And by the end of his speech, there were tears, applause, and a silence deeper than words, a silence of reflection, of truth, of impact. And as he stepped off the stage, he knew in his heart that this wasn't the end of his story, only the beginning of a lifelong promise, to always stand where no one else will, and to never let silence win again. Asterisk.